Hello, my name is Kendra Houseman from Out of the Shadows. I'm going to talk about a few things, but I think I want to talk about, first of all, about power. So I think that people view me as quite a powerful woman or as a powerful person. And I suppose I portray myself as quite a powerful person. But that's because I've seen the lack of power throughout my life. So domestic abuse is something that I think is everywhere, and people just don't talk about it, or they don't know how to talk about it, or they don't want to talk about it. So domestic abuse and other ACEs, adverse childhood events, they're the things that can cause a child to go on to be exploited. They're the things that can open up their vulnerabilities, and all of them ACEs will be outside of that child's control completely. And that's the bit that's really frustrating, because they're outside of the child's control. So therefore, what can the child really do about them? But in my case, so my parents were a little bit older when they had me for a lot of reasons, but just know that I was born when my parents were a little bit older, and I was born into violence. I was born into severe domestic abuse. And I say this, that it was happening before I was born, during the pregnancy, after I was born, but never at me. So no one ever physically hurt me, as in my parents. And so what really frustrated me from a very young age, and I mean a young age, I can't even remember what age it was, but I remember knowing that it wasn't fair that was happening, that it wasn't fair what was happening to my family within my home. And so as I got a little bit older, I couldn't understand how, just because the abuser of my mum was my dad, that he never got in trouble for it. It really, as a young age, I'm talking about 7 maybe, I really struggled with that. And I would watch my mum be very forgiving of him the whole time. Like, she would forgive him over and over again. And I, at a very young age, couldn't understand that. And so I quite recently spoke in a blog about how I feel about domestic abuse and domestic violence. For a start, I hate them words. I hate the fact by putting the word domestic in front of something, it makes it less of an abuse, like, honestly. And so, and I haven't really spoke about this out loud. I write it, but I haven't spoke it, but let's do it. So my mum and dad were always arguing, always arguing. When I say we were arguing, my mum didn't really argue back, but my dad would always be saying, he always had an opinion on something. And I was born in the 80s, and it was an era still where what happened in the home stayed in the home. It was almost as if some things were acceptable within the marital home, and it was like that. And my mum most definitely didn't question it, because she had been with my dad since she was 13 years of age. And I remember speaking to her afterwards, years later, and she said, that's just how it was. That's just how it was for women back then. And so he would just abuse her in every way, physically, mentally, financially, socially. She was isolated. When he was there, she was just, shielded from him the whole time. But because he never put his hands, he never physically hit me, he justified that to himself in the way that I never hit her. So therefore, why is it a problem? And I could say many different accounts, but the one that I can remember defining moment is that my dad had been wherever he'd been, and he turned up at the house drunk, and my mum wouldn't let him in. I can't clearly remember that, but she wouldn't let him in. And he started booting the flat door. We lived in a block of flats, and if you can imagine it, the echo, like, our house never had no carpet at the time, so you boom, boom. My dad was 6'7", big Italian man, big hands, and when he kicked this door, it come with power. And the whole block would have heard it, the whole estate would have heard it, and nobody done nothing, because that was the time, or because they were scared of him, because he was quite scary. And I can remember my mum sitting with me. We had no heating at the time, and she's cuddling me. My mum's crying but trying to comfort me. So she knows what's coming. I know what's coming. We both know what's going to happen, and she's trying to comfort me. And I can remember then, I must have been 5 or 6. And I remember then just switching off, like thinking, this is fake, that we know we can't stop what's going to happen. At no point did I think, should someone call the police? And then he eventually got in. And so my mum put me on a big armchair with a tray with a puzzle in it to try and distract me from what was going on. And he's shouting, who knows what he's shouting, but he's swearing in Italian, in English, really having a go at her. And I remember just sitting with the tray, and my mum sort of mouthing to me saying, go to bed. And I was, no, because I knew something bad was going to happen. And so, like I say, my dad was 6'7", massive. He'd been to prison on and off for a long time, so he was built like really big man. My mum at the time was about 5'5", and she was gaunt. Like, so all she did was eat my leftovers, lots of medication, high anxiety. The bones there were always protruding, very wide eyes, and beautiful. She was beautiful, but she was wafer. There was nothing there of my mum. So you got my dad at 5'7", and my mum just this tiny shadow of a woman, and he would beat her like he was their equal. He would beat my mum. Like, I've seen it so many times, like she was his size, and she would very rarely put her hands up. And this time he was shouting, and she just put her hands down by her side. She didn't do nothing. And then out of nowhere, he just punched her in the face. And then as she sort of covered her face, he then punched her in the belly. But he's so much bigger that when he punched her, she lifted up. And they were behind the sofa. We pulled the sofa to be around the Calagas fire. That's how old it is. And they were behind the sofa. And so I'm watching this. And then he punched her again. And then her nose or her lip split. And blood just went everywhere. And I can always remember that. Like, there was just lots of blood all over his hands, really bright red blood. And she must have either passed out or he knocked her out. And she disappeared behind the back of the sofa. And then my dad started shouting and screaming. And he's now kicking her. It sounds like he's kicking the sofa. Obviously, I can't see. But she's not moving. There's no sound. And I can remember saying, is she dead? Like saying, is she dead? Let me see. Let me see. Like, I want to protect her, but I haven't moved from my tray. I'm just saying, I want to see. And then I just started screaming, Mummy, Mummy. And my dad just switched, and he come over and he's like, oh, Bella, Bella. And this is his Italian accent. Picks me up and takes me into my room and tries to soothe me. Like, he can see I'm in distress, and he's trying to soothe me. And he makes me porridge, and he tries to get me to sleep, and because it's nice and warm. And my mum is still on the floor groaning. I can hear her. So at 7 or 6, whatever age I was, my dad loves me. He's shown me that he loves me. He's protecting me. He just battered my mum. And the amount of times growing up I didn't know if my mum was dead is, now I think of it as an adult, is disgusting. At least once a fortnight, I didn't know if she had died. And sometimes she'd go to hospital, I wouldn't know where she was. And at any age, and what I'm saying sounds extreme, but there's so many families growing up like that, that I had to regulate these feelings. Like, this man's just tried to kill my mum. Is my mum okay? Actually, I'm quite sleepy and I like the porridge. And so he, because it's his fault, he changed my understanding of norms for a person. And he's changed my understanding of what it's like to be a normal person. It was all twisted and messed up. And that's just one account of the aces that I faced. That's just one little part of it. But it definitely had a massive impact, because as I grew older, I knew there at that minute there that it wasn't fair. I knew that my dad should be arrested. I knew the police should come. I knew that as a little kid, I knew that, and they didn't. The police did come sometimes, and nothing was ever done. And what happened is that I had no voice, because if I told anyone, always, I had told people, and they'd always say the same thing. They would say, Mum and Dad's argue. And my mum would come to Scotland and they'd be like, Mum and Dad's argue. And nobody would listen to what I was saying about anything. So I just stopped telling people. But obviously they could see it, because I would look neglected sometimes. Sometimes my mum wouldn't be able to see out of her eyes, and I wouldn't have breakfast. And nobody done nothing. Services were often involved. And so a feminist group called Philia, I gave a speech once, and they announced me as Kendra failed by the state. That's exactly right. And I see it still now. Children that I work with, or whatever, children in society face these ACEs, these adverse childhood events that they have no control over, that impact their whole entire life. And so then when we see a child, for an example, with a knife, so that's the end product. We've got the child with the knife. I always, and it's easy for me to do that, but I also always think to myself, what led them there? You know, what led this young person to be involved in gangs? What led this young person to do these things? And so until we get an understanding of ACEs, a true understanding of how these impact on children, I don't think we can ever sort out exploitation and gangs, because we don't really understand, unless you've been through it, how that stuff feels. It's very frustrating. Okay, so, and I really, really struggle with this. I don't understand why every single perpetrator of domestic abuse or violence is not charged with child abuse when they do it in front of a child. And this is, and I mean this in a very deep, like, it's coming from my heart. I don't understand it, because what my dad did in front of me, if you ask my mum or my dad if he ever abused me, they will say no. Like, they're not alive now, but I guarantee you they'd say no. I spoke to my dad on a level. He thinks he didn't cause me no abuse because he didn't touch me. Yeah, and he didn't shout at me. He was kind to me. I believe that any perpetrator of domestic or violence or abuse should be charged with child abuse, because they're inflicting emotional, physical, neglect, all them things they're inflicting on the child. The child witnesses that. So therefore, why should then people be allowed around any more children? Because a lot of people that are involved in domestic abuse and violence, they go on to do that to other families and girls, and they do it again. It's the amount of times that I work with one parent and they then go on and they will be abusive in another household. So why aren't they being charged with child abuse? It doesn't happen until the child is physically hurt. Then you might see a charge. And this is very real. Like, this isn't something I'm talking about this week. This week, I have dealt with cases where there has been domestic abuse, and that's dealt with between what's happened between the adults, and the children are in that, but there's no charge. The charge will be for the physical attack that they may have inflicted on the other parent. There's nothing about the children that have witnessed it. And the rise in domestic abuse and violence since lockdown, oh my goodness, I'm going to say it's 70%. Like, I haven't got figures in front of me, but I have looked at them. And so the rise, because no one should spend that much time together. And what do we do with that? It's all very well for the government to throw money out there and say, oh, here's funding, you're a victim of DV, you can leave. You think we can just get up and leave? Like, it's frustrating, because the long-term impact of domestic abuse and violence can go on a lifetime. A lot of people that have been victim of abuse will go on to be in abusive relationships. So my personal opinion, I don't care who I offend, if there is a perpetrator of domestic abuse or violence in front of a child, they should be charged with child abuse. You've got domestic abuse, right? That's just one, ACEs. Then chuck in, for me, so my big two ACEs were domestic abuse and parental mental health. Parental mental health right now is still not supported. Like, it's just round and round. It's like I'm reliving my story with people in different ways. But my mum's mental health was never addressed in the right way at all. And so many professionals saw it. So it wasn't like it was hidden. It was so massive. And then I was almost my mum's carer. Like, I was my mum's carer most of my life until she died, on and off. But at other times, when my mum was well, she was a very strong parent. So I had to switch roles daily sometimes. So one minute I was mum, then she was mum, then I was mum. And I can remember being like, what the fuck? Like, I didn't know what was going on. So most families will have mental health inside them. So that's another one. So we've got the DV, let's just chuck in mental health, sprinkling some addiction, and then we're putting, we as the product, we start having some unhealthy relationships. And it's not rocket science. It's not like this thing is new. I'm telling you now that the ACEs are so, like, people are looking for an answer, how to stop exploitation, gangs, how to stop this stuff. We need to go back to that, the basics. But for whatever reason, people won't. Social services are better now. It's not that, it's the law. It's like, there's so much going on. There's so much going on that, no, you haven't always got good social workers, just the same way you haven't always got good police or good teachers, but there's no way are they all bad social workers. It's the laws and the boundaries they work in haven't changed from when we were kids. So how can they be expected to perform a miracle? What we need to do is strip that right back. We need to be educating kids from this age onwards about feminism, about, because it is women that suffer domestic abuse more than men, whether that people like that, that's the figures. We need to be educating men and women what healthy relationships look like, and then therefore grow them young people into people. You know, we've got children in school learning maths, English and science, but they do need to learn life skills also. We also need to educate people that are entrenched, historical abuse, that they go on to do it, they go on to do it. How do you find them families? Who knows? Because they're hiding in the first place,